G'day folks, my name is Rob and welcome back for another F1 fantasy video. In today's video, I will be joined on the channel by another guest as part of my guest interview series for 2025. Ross Dowsett, who many of you may know in fantasy Premier League circles as FPL RAPTOR, will be discussing with me the psychology element of playing fantasy sports. For those of you that don't know Ross and his content, he has more than 340,000 subscribers and followers across Twitter and YouTube, and is one of the brightest minds, not just in the fantasy content creation space, but also the psychology element of how to gain an edge in fantasy sports and how to manage your emotions and strategy throughout an entire season. Now, you might be asking, why are you getting someone that does Premier League content for a living on here? And hopefully throughout the video that answers your question. Ross is also a passionate Formula One fan who has played F1 fantasy in the past. And I think that's a perfect intersection for this kind of video. So if you're enjoying the content today, be sure to drop a like on the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And if there are other guests, whether it's in Formula One, Premier League, or some other vertical in the fantasy sports or other worlds, let me know down in the comments below if you'd like to see them on. But in the meantime, and as Ross would say, without further ado, let's jump into it. Ladies and gents, today I'm joined by Ross Dowsett, also known in fantasy Premier League circles as FPL RAPTOR. Ross is one of the largest content creators in this space and is undertaking a PhD currently in sports psychology. He's also an author, publishing the book The Mind Game in 2021, which focuses on gaining a psychological edge in fantasy Premier League. So I think as part of that, want to use the opportunity to chat to Ross a bit about that aspect in fantasy sports. And Ross knows everything about that. He's been a fantasy Premier League manager for a number of years now. And I look back at his ranks over the last 4 years. He's inside the top 0.002% of all players over that period of time. So a remarkable record. And I thought there'd be no better person to get on today and talk about psychology in fantasy sports. So I'll let everyone digest that for a second. Ross, thank you for coming on today. How are you and how's the preseason?
Thank you very much for the invite, and thank you for the wonderful intro as well. That was very, very good and very accurate. And you're also one of the only people that pronounces my name correctly, the Dowsett part. So thank you very much for that. No, I'm good. I think this is the exciting part of any fantasy game. It's like the pre-part, because listen, fantasy games, as we'll discuss, they can be quite toggling across a season and they can really mess with your psyche. And we're going to get into all of that today. But pre-season is the part where you can have unlimited fun, but you don't actually have the negative outcomes. So like, I can pick whichever players I want. I can change all of that around. And it's the same in F1 fantasy as well. But you don't actually know whether it's good or not. So I think this is arguably the most sort of fun point of any sort of any fantasy game.
Yeah, no, agreed. There's the most tinkering, there's the most strategy. I think as soon as the first race or the first game kicks off, there's perhaps a convergence towards maybe one or a couple of different approaches. But I think that's this time of year is the most experimental, and I think what's so exciting about it for both creators and consumers alike. So excited to see the content. I mean, I'll link all of Ross's channels and such in the description below, but as I was saying just before off camera, you've been punching out so much content this preseason, mate. So it's exciting to see.
Yeah, it's the fun part. I mean, like I say, I'm spending all day every day thinking about it, so might as well put some content out as well.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'll dive straight into it because I know there's a lot to discuss in this next while. Before we get into the psychology aspect, we connected on Twitter X a couple years ago, I would say, and I think at the time you were dabbling in F1 fantasy, but as you mentioned to me before, it's probably something you distance yourself from because you just wanted to enjoy the race. And I totally get that. As someone who enjoys watching the sport, I can understand that perspective. How did you get into Formula One? Is it something that's kind of always been on your radar? Were you a DTS convert, kind of a hybrid of different reasons? I'm curious because I know you've got such an investment in the Premier League, but F1 has a natural overlap for many people as well.
Yeah, I remember the F1 used to be on the TV at the weekend, and I used to, as a kid, just like see bits and pieces of it. And then I had like friendship groups and people that were just so into F1, and I really wanted to get into it, but I didn't really understand like how. I started watching a couple of YouTube videos because as much as people say it's just cars driving round and round, we know there is so much more. It's arguably one of the most complicated sports out there off the racetrack and obviously on it as well. So I wanted to get into it, but I found it a little bit overwhelming. So one of my good friends, Yelena, who's also an FPL content creator, she was like, just watch Drive to Survive. She was like, a lot of the F1 fan base won't be happy that that's your route into it. it, but it will give you a really basic understanding. And so I watched that, and I immediately was obviously hooked. But I, not from like the drama perspective, but just understanding like the nitty gritty details. But it's really useful, I think, for people that want to get into the sport. Like everyone memes Will Buxton for his comments in Drive to Survive, but for someone that is new to the sport, they actually are genuinely quite helpful. So I found that as a nice little intro to it. And again, because I'm so like attention to detail, wanting to understand everything, I just went from there and tried to really, really understand the sport, strategy, things like that. And I'm by no means an expert, but since then I've absolutely loved it. And I would say, and I think a lot of F1 fans might realize this, but the more you get into F1, the less Drive to Survive kind of feels like it's a good representation of the sport. So the most recent season, now that I am more into F1, I actually didn't enjoy that as much, whereas a lot of other people did. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. But I get a kind of a hybrid, but more so Drive to Survive.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's right of people to gatekeep Formula One because you got into the sport through DTS. But I think it was regardless, a nice little juncture for a lot of casuals to really integrate into the sport. And it's funny you mentioned kind of how focused the sport is around data and insights, because I know how much of an FPL manager you are when it comes to that. And I myself kind of follow that same theme with F1 Fantasy. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But in the meantime, just in terms of kind of psychology generally in the fantasy world, you've talked a lot about it in your Psychology 101 series on YouTube, which hopefully makes a return at some point in the future. But I thoroughly did enjoy that series. And we I guess if we can focus on, you know, a couple of different storylines in the Formula One environment. And I mean, you know everything about operating under pressure as someone who performs at an elite sporting level with the Tottenham Hotspur Youth Academy back in the day. But if we focus more on some of the under pressure storylines, we could maybe give me an example of one that you found fascinating in Formula One this season, but perhaps also one you're looking forward to in the Premier League for 2025-26.
Yeah, so I was having this chat with someone the other day. So my sports psychology degree and my master's as well, it's all focused on performance under pressure. Because if you consider the skill level of these athletes, yes, there are differences in skill between Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri and Max Verstappen. These are all highly skilled athletes. On their day, all of them, if they're given obviously the car, they can put that in a really, really good position. So if we look at Oscar and Lando, very, very similar sort of skill level, very, very similar machinery. They should be every single race exactly the same, but they're not. And of course, there are different racetracks where they might perform better. But what that then comes down to is personality type, resilience, things like that. So I would say psychology and the ability to perform under pressure is like the key differentiating factor between a successful athlete and one that's not. And it's the same in Premier League football as well. So yeah, I would say from a psychology perspective, me watching Lando versus Oscar every week is incredibly... I mean, I'd love to just sit down and just interview the pair of them, because you've got two completely different personality types. You've got ice cold Oscar, who just seems to just be very unfazed, positive and negative, by the way. Like his first race win and he's just like, cheers guys. It's like, in comparison to Lando Norris, who shows every element of emotion. There's an interesting thing in sport. I don't think it's been looked at in F1, but it's called reward and punishment sensitivity. And the idea is that some athletes respond super, super well to the possibility of reward. So if a coach or a manager, whoever it is, says to them, if you perform really well, you might get a pay rise. Or if you perform really well, like the team will be really impressed. Like this idea that people will be proud if you're impressed if you perform well, that means you are quite sensitive to the idea of reward. Some athletes perform really well. Raheem Sterling was a good example in the Premier League. He's an athlete that responds really well to that arm around the shoulder kind of approach. If you do well, we'll be really happy with you.
Yeah.
But then some athletes actually respond really well to the threat of punishment. Like if you don't perform, you're going to lose your seat. Some athletes will actually respond to that. And I would say that F1 is generally quite a punishment-sensitive environment. Like, there's not much reward for it, apart from obviously monetary. But it's just like you're going to lose your seat if you don't perform, is that constant battle. And I would say that I look at someone like Lando. Lando does not respond well, I don't think, to the threat of punishment or the threat of not necessarily losing his seat, but the threat of just Oscar's going to overtake you. I feel like he needs an arm around the shoulder. You're doing really well, Lando, which I know Zach Brown probably attempts to do, but I feel like the environment of F1 being so cutthroat and so just there's very little like I say, like reward and positive feedback. I don't feel like that suits Lando particularly well. And I can just see in his head, like you know for a fact Lando spends his time scrolling through social media. You do, because he says things of like, I know what's being said in the media. Oscar very rarely says what is being said in the media, because I can imagine he's the sort of guy that probably doesn't pay much attention to it. So I feel like the environment just doesn't suit Lando. I mean, maybe not even a controversial comment. I would say Lando is very, very, if not slightly better in terms of skill level. Like, if you were to give them the exact same mentality, I think Lando's a faster driver, and I would expect him to outperform Oscar. But then, personality-wise, Oscar is leagues ahead. So I'm finding that very, very interesting. But I just don't think that Lando has the natural mentality to perform at an elite level over a consistent period of time, which is why we see these peaks and troughs from him, because he's going on this emotional roller coaster himself.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been interesting because, even one of the more recent races, Belgium, it was a very clear indication of, Lando's edging closer and closer to Oscar to, contend for the lead, and then, those errors, those unforced errors creep in. But you give Lando Norris kind of unobstructed track, he can be out in front and he will just ride the wheels off that car, fastest lap after fastest lap. But as soon as I feel like he's in a pressure heavy environment, that's when those errors, which every driver makes, but it just feels like the focus is more on Lando than anyone else because he's got that race winning car, as you say, and it's him versus a third year teammate who has come forward in leaps and bounds this year. So it's fascinating.
In sport, a lot of times, what pressure forces us to do. So, as elite athletes, if you're an elite athlete and you perform at a high level, you do things subconsciously and what we call implicitly. So, if I was to ask you to think about walking down the road, no one thinks, well, at least if you've been walking for a while, you don't think left foot in front of right foot, in front of left foot, right? You do these things implicitly. And that then translates to football, to F1. They're not really thinking about how much to move the steering wheel or how much pressure to apply on braking, at least not explicitly. These are things they just know. But when you're put under pressure sometimes, and I would say this happens to Lando in Q3, and he's put under pressure and he knows he has to perform, what you start to do is you break down the skill. So you do start thinking, how early should I be braking? Or how much should I steer into this corner? Or what is this correct path of the car? They don't really need to be thinking about these things. They can process it implicitly. No. But under pressure, you start thinking about it explicitly. It's the same with a penalty under pressure. If you take a penalty in football, we could all score, even amateur level, a penalty. It's not a difficult skill. No. But you start thinking about, where do I place my feet? How hard should I kick this? And so I can almost feel that in Lando, in those critical moments, he's overthinking everything and he's breaking down something where, again, if you just put him under no pressure and just say, go around and have fun, I think Lando's quicker 80% of the time.
I'd agree more than that, perhaps. Yeah, he's qualifying, with the exception of one or two instances this season, has been top notch. 4 pole positions, Oscar's had just as many. So I think over a single lap, like you say, Ross, there's really not much, if anything, separating them. But that mental fortitude, it just comes all the way back to whether or not he's got that internal strength to put that to the back of his mind and just focus on, what's the road that is in front of him. So
the positive thing is you can learn these things, right? So you can learn strategy. So I'm not saying that Lando never will, but I think if we're talking inherently, innately within these two people, and I think Lando knows this, by the way, if you were to ask him, he puts out these kind of, he sounds angry when he says, I'm not as strong, or I'm not this, I'm not that. He beats himself up. He will know more than anyone that he's not got the correct mentality right now. I just think he needs, and I'm sure he has one, but he needs a really elite sports psychologist. Because if you speak to a lot of Olympians that have performed at a really high level in cycling and running, they'll all refer to, in their winning speech, when they'll all say, thank you to my sports psychologist. It's so important, especially in an individual sport like F1. And of course, it's a team sport, thousands of engineers, whatever, but it's an individual sport. You need to have the strongest mentality. So I really hope Lando gets a sports psychologist, a manager that can understand it and to try and help him improve. Because even a 20% improvement in the way that he's thinking during a race or during qualifying, that could be the difference between winning the championship and not.
Agreed. Yeah, no, exactly right. You hit the nail on the head there. And I think kind of segues nicely into the next thing I wanted to pick your brains on, Ross, because, I think even to use that example of almost setting the expectations lower so there isn't as much pressure to perform. I even do that myself in F1 Fantasy with picking this. I almost say, this driver's going to DNF, so I almost set myself up for little or less disappointment. I think kind of when it comes to the decision-making process generally in fantasy sports, I think this applies to F1 Fantasy, Fantasy Premier League, Fantasy NFL, whatever you want to call it. The decisions and perhaps a degree of bias certainly comes into play, whether that's recency, confirmation, some other form of bias around form, the experience of a driver or a football player, fixtures in Premier League, for instance, upcoming tracks in Formula One. When it comes to making these week-to-week decisions for our fantasy teams and that bias that, exists regardless of how much or little credit you want to give to it. Do you think that is the same for every fantasy player, how they approach their strategy, how they construct their teams? Or do you think it naturally changes based on, say, a person's risk appetite or profile for how they approach planning?
I'd say kind of both, all of the above. So I won't get too nerdy here, but in psychology, when we analyze data, there's a thing called reflexivity. If like you're analyzing data from a study that you've been involved in as the researcher. And the idea there is that before you analyze the data, you should understand how your viewpoint, your belief system affects the way that you analyze the data. And I would say the same in fantasy sports. So you need to sit back and think, how does my views on how F1 works as a sport, my biases towards certain teams, certain drivers, how will that impact how I go about my decisions? Have a real sit there and think, like, am I going to be biased towards this team? Am I going to be biased towards having a certain strategy? And once you can sit there and think about your role, I think that makes it a lot easier to then start to spot where you're making mistakes. But the bias that I always lead with when I'm talking about biases is the bias blind spot, which is, I think, is a perfect. So cognitive biases are basically shortcuts that we have that often can lead to suboptimal decision making. Yep. The bias blind spot basically says that as humans, we can't spot biases in our own decision making. So you can sit there and think about all you want, but you won't ever be able to understand and identify all of the biases that affect the way you make decisions. I would say, kind of in F1 though, you mentioned recency bias. Football, but more so F1, it's such a dynamic sport.
Truly.
One race to the next, someone can go from being top of the grid to like a middle of the pack, and then they could just stay there for the whole season. We saw like McLaren last season, halfway through the season, bring some upgrades. Other teams don't bring the upgrades, find a setup that works, or they go through a specific set of tracks that we know through the midpoint of the season. And all of a sudden, it's a completely different game. And so you can think about what's happened in the past, right? You can think about previous points and but you've just got to be so willing to adapt and be dynamic. And it's the same with biases. You might have this bias that Lance Stroll is an absolutely terrible driver and you never have him, right? Let's say Aston Martin bring tons of upgrades and all of a sudden then you just have to adapt and be willing to forget that bias. So I think, I always say in FPL, but really in F1, I mean, I'm not really playing the F1 fantasy, but I think the thing that I would struggle with is adapting and changing because it is an ever adapting sport.
No, fully agree. It evolves every couple of weeks. You see a completely different shift in the template, and I think that's maybe why we get 2 transfers a week instead of the 1 in FPL. But it is something that, I think I sometimes struggle with, especially when you've been on a certain driver for X number of weeks and they're suddenly out of form. And I mean, I look at that the same way for FPL because I play it too. And, the fixture swings are massive. Injuries play a huge role in how you structure your team, no doubt. And I think it's just fascinating to see so many different players have very different strategies with how they approach their team every week, whether it comes to chips or transfers. It's interesting.
Yeah, I think so. And I think the better you can, this is the whole point of this kind of podcast episode, is that the better you understand yourself, the better you will do in fantasy. When I wrote my book, I remember the kind of catchphrase was, this is as much a book about yourself as it is about FPL. And this discussion here, when we're talking about bias system, it's more about kind of yourself, how you make decisions. And then you can apply that to fantasy, but you can also apply that to every part of your life. So I think the more you understand about why you make certain decisions, the more you question why you've made that decision, whether in fantasy or not, I think you'll improve the way that you play.
No, that's an interesting point you make, just around kind of how one perceives themselves and their decisions and that. And I think, there's obviously one side of playing fantasy sports where you make these clutch decisions or these informed decisions, they pay off, you see a green arrow. There's the other side of that, naturally, where something doesn't go your way. And, in F1 fantasy, for instance, the DNF penalties are probably the most painful part of playing the game because of how significant the swings are with ranks and points. The assistant manager in FPL last year was a good example of something that was very swingy too. Now, for me personally, and I've certainly become better at it in the last couple of years, but when you go through those periods of, struggling with your fantasy team, the decisions just don't seem to be going your way. And, I, for one, can sometimes get too caught up in the emotions and the disappointment of it. But I've found sometimes stepping back, as easy as it is, and I think, you and I are perfect examples of people who are on the front line kind of farming out content to consumers. kind of how you process difficult game weeks. And I know you went through a patch, I think it was either last year or the year before, where I think you went on a run of several bad weeks of fantasy scores. I had the same for the second half of last year. Kind of how do you process bad results? Because I think everyone, again, processes these differently, but it's still part of the nature of playing a fantasy sport.
Yeah, I mean, we could do a 5-hour episode just on that. But I think firstly, acknowledge that like if you care about something, it's gonna suck when it doesn't go well. So I don't think we're ever going to sit here and just sign like smile. It'll be fine if it's something. If you spent all that time doing research and you get a DNF and all of a sudden you have a bad week, yeah, exactly, a red card or something happens and it's out. That feels awful because it's like I put in so much effort. So acknowledge that it's going to feel bad and we can't really change that element. But I think you can definitely make it feel slightly less bad and reduce the magnitude of those feelings. The next thing I would say, and we've kind of hinted to it there is so much luck in fantasy sports because you can't control you've got no control over the outcome. Like you can put together a perfectly viable team, but you can't control the outcome. In football, it's 11 versus 11 across 10 different matches. In F1, you've got real life people driving around a track at insane speeds with machinery that realistically we have no idea what their setup is. We have no idea what we're seeing in free practice if that's relevant to qualifying. We can hypothesize, but again, there is a lot of luck involved. So really acknowledge the luck element, and it helps to laugh it off a bit because it is ridiculous, right? If you get 2 DNFs or you get 3 red cards, it's ridiculous. Like there's nothing we can do.
No.
And then if all of that doesn't help, there's 2 things. So first, you say take a step back. Just get rid of everything, right? Turn off your phone or get off social media. Get away from your TV, right? If you've had a terrible, like the Grand Prix gone horribly, don't watch all of the post-race interviews. You don't need to do that. You can watch them another time. If you're struggling with your rank, why are you scrolling through and looking at everyone's great rank on social media? That's not going to help you. So get away, step back, go to the gym, go for a walk, cook some food, say hello to your family once in a while, which we don't really do as fantasy managers, and like just get out of that environment.
Touch grass.
Exactly, literally just touch some grass. But my favorite is something called self-distancing. So the idea of self-distancing is the reason that we struggle with things in fantasy going badly or things in real life is we're really enveloped by that situation as things stand. So if I would come to you and I said, Rob, I'm really struggling with fantasy, what do you recommend? You'd probably sit there and give me some pretty decent advice. And if you came to me and said that, as I am now, I'd be able to give you some okay advice. Yeah. But then when it happens to you, the advice goes out the window.
You don't think about it.
Because you're the one experiencing the emotions and you're the one that's enveloped in that situation. So essentially, the logical next step then is that's the issue, how do you kind of pick yourself up and pull yourself out of that situation? How do you make it so that you're not so enveloped? So you essentially want to try and remind yourself of the bigger picture, remind yourself that whilst it feels absolutely rubbish right now, it's probably not as bad as it initially seems. So there are a couple of ways to do this. You can write statements on your phone that you read if you want to go through it in a formal way, which is things like, in 1 year time, will I really care that I had a really poor week in F1 fantasy for the Belgian Grand Prix? You won't. In fact, unless you are your memory is impeccable, you probably won't even remember how your team did in the Belgian Grand Prix last year, or how my team did. I don't even know what happened in...
Russell disqualification, but anyway.
Yeah, I don't even know what happened in Game Week 11 last season. And even if you do, like, you're sort of laughing about that now, because it's funny now.
Of course.
Because in the future, now won't seem so bad. So it's kind of reminding yourself of that. There's also something called the 5x5 rule, which is if something won't bother you in 5 years' time, don't spend more than 5 minutes thinking about it.
Yeah.
I don't think that necessarily works all the time, but I think it's a nice sentiment. The sentiment is, if something's not truly important, why are you spending two days of your time really fretting over it? So I guess the key thing is just try and realize that even like for us, like it's part of a job, right? It's we create content for a living. Like it's important to us. Even for us, it really doesn't matter if you have a couple of bad weeks. Like it's not in the overall big picture of your life, family, your health. Those are the things that are important. So I think it's trying to remind yourself of those key aspects.
No, it's really good insights. And I think it's very, very easy to get caught up in the whole groundswell of negative emotions or challenging reactions to bad weeks. You see it so much on Twitter and X and Instagram and YouTube comments. I think a lot of people, and like I said, myself included, just have sometimes those challenges with processing it. But like you say, it is really taking a step back. And I almost find, yes, you have a bad week, but it's almost better for me when there's a race the following weekend, because it's so much easier to put those results to the back of your mind faster than having to say wait for 4 weeks until the summer break or an international break comes around to an end. So it is, yeah, it's just one of those things that come with the territory of playing fantasy sports. I do want to pivot a little bit into something that's probably more recent in the last couple of seasons, around gut instinct versus data-driven insight. So I alluded to it before, Ross, because I know how much of an ardent supporter and voice you are for insights and data that informs your decisions. And particularly in the last few years with the emergence of AI, and I really want to talk about that a little bit with fantasy sports, kind of how that helps us guiding our transfer and chip strategy decisions every week. I almost think I know the answer as to whether or not you lean on more data than gut, but kind of how do you approach it, and kind of is there a way you can strike a balance? I want to talk about AI kind of separately and kind of in tandem with this, but kind of first things first, are you more gut driven, data driven? Do you find there's a nice middle spot for those two things?
Yeah, so I'll probably surprise you and say that I'm more gut-driven in my decision-making in fantasy sports and in real life, but I absolutely agree. So there's this thing called the law of instrument bias, which is basically if you over-rely on one tool, you're going to keep making really poor decisions. You can't always use one thing to make decisions. So I think if you only rely on your gut or you only rely on data, you're going to make poor decisions in any aspect. So there is a combination to be had. I've done tons of research into gut feeling because I find it super interesting. Now, what is gut feeling? Listen to your gut. I don't even know what that means. Like, what is intuition? So I've read tons of chapters and articles on gut feeling, and really there's not any super compelling evidence that gut feeling will lead to better decision making. There's not much to say that it will lead to poor decision making either, but there's nothing to say that gut feeling is superior. There is a little bit of research which says that what your gut is your brain making subconscious connections between things that you already know. So you probably have much more advanced knowledge of F1 and fantasy than you even realize. Like if you were to list how many things you probably know 100 times more than that. If you've seen the film Limitless, I think it is, where he's like, I think it's like the pill gives you 100% access to your brain, and you can actually only access 20% of what your brain knows.
Yeah,
By the way, that isn't real, but you also can't always consciously access everything that you know. So there is a theory that gut feeling essentially pulls on all of the things that we can't consciously process and compiles them, and that is what gut feeling is. Again, that's not super supported, but I do believe that gut feeling often is more than just, it's what I fancy doing. It's kind of, it's pulling on things that you might not necessarily know at that point. So yes, gut feeling could help. But what I think gut feeling is helpful for, and there is tons of research into this, is it removes resentment about the decisions that you make. So if I'm choosing between two players, one is supported by the data, or two drivers, one supported by the data, one is supported by my gut feeling, I would say 10 times out of 10, if there's a negative outcome and you back the data-driven decision, then I would say in that case, you're going to be really resentful. Whereas if you back your gut decision and it doesn't go well, you're much less likely to like resent that decision and feel really angry about it, because you're like, do you know what? At the end of the day, yeah, I ignore the data, but I wanted to just trust my gut. So when I'm giving decisions in FPL, it's a bit of a cop-out as a content creator. I'll always say, trust your gut feeling. But the reason for that is if you just trust us because we said it, and it doesn't go well, you're going to be like, why did I listen to this idiot, right?
I agree, yeah.
Whereas if you're doing something because you believe it, at the end of the day, you can only blame yourself, right? So I would always advocate trusting your gut feeling, not because I necessarily think it's superior or more likely to be accurate. I just feel like emotionally, you are much more likely to have a less negative outcome associated with that decision.
No, I agree. And I find that that's something that I almost try to hang my hat on for my own decisions most race weeks. Like for instance, heading into, Belgium, Hungary, etc., I almost feel like my mind was made up before seeing free practice, which is a terrible thing to have when you haven't actually seen how cars are performing on track. But the transfers I have in mind are not locked in, but certainly going down that path. And ultimately, when it ends up going that way, the data itself is more of a reassurance than actually the driving force behind my decision making. It's nice to see when that aligns. There are times when it doesn't, and sometimes I pivot in favor of the data. Sometimes I pivot away from that. But I think there is some degree of just being at peace with the decisions. And I think for me personally, when I head into a deadline stream, and I'm sure you've had the same experience before, where you're so indecisive or you're not entirely set on what transfers you want to make, it almost feels like for me personally, the transfers don't turn out the way I anticipated because there's so many moving parts, right? But I find that I've been much better at kind of, particularly on streams where there's so many people asking questions, you can get overwhelmed very quickly with what the right outcome or the right decision is. And I think, at least for me, my decision making is definitely better in the last season or two, just because of the fact that I'm trying to make a decision for myself rather than, say, an outside influence.
Yeah, I think the thing you have to remember is, if you're watching this now, whether it's FPL, F1 Fantasy, whatever you play, you've got a baseline level of knowledge, and your instinct isn't going to throw you too far off. So if your intuition is to go for a player, yes, that might not be the best player, but unless you are really poor at the game, it's not gonna send you down a completely wrong direction. Like, you're not going to choose a driver that you know is going to finish 20th. So if your gut's telling you to pick a certain driver, it's because you know a little bit of something about the sport, and you at least understand that there's a chance. And again, if I go back to the luck element, you also just need to get lucky. Like, you could pick a player or a driver that is perfect on paper and does terribly, or you could pick one that's terrible on paper that you just get super lucky with. So if you also acknowledge the luck element, it's like, do you know what? Why not just trust yourself? Because even if it is a bad decision, you could end up getting lucky anyway. So just, I would really, really encourage people to own their decisions, trust their gut feeling, but also don't over rely on it, and try and have, whether it be data, whether it be, I don't know, it could be a number of things. Just have one other tool that you use to sort of cross-reference that gut feeling.
But limit, I find, the number of things that are driving that decision. I feel like
two or three key things.
5 or 6 things, it really starts to blur the lines a little bit. Now,
I would agree.
Now, I mentioned this before around AI and how that factors into fantasy sports. I'm yet to see it really come to the forefront in F1 fantasy, but I have seen, I'd say, tidbits of it in FPL over the last season or two. Generally speaking, kind of, how do you see AI influencing the fantasy sports world? Because I think it's such an important part of the evolving landscape of the world generally today, and it will no doubt factor into how fantasy sports are played and strategized. What's your read on it so far? Do you think it has a place in fantasy sports?
I think whether it has a place or not, we just have to accept it. I think when the world develops a certain way, it's like there's no point fighting it. And
no,
I don't say that just as someone as a content creator. I say that as just an understanding of you can't fight certain things. You can't not expect technology and AI to be involved. So I think once we accept that it kind of has to be there, the good thing is, what we have to do in these games and these sports is predict the future, which, famous last words, I don't think AI can ever do. Like, I don't think AI will ever be able to predict what drivers are going to do, because they don't even know what they're going to do. Like, if someone clips the front wing of another car, AI has no way of...
No idea.
And the same in football. Even if you know exactly what all of the millions of data points are and you can model that perfect, they still don't know if a player's going to miss a shot from 5 yards out. So the good thing is, as good as these models will eventually probably become, they are beatable. They always will be. And I think you take it as a challenge. So if you are someone that's listening, because I know there are tons of people that really hate the word AI or the idea of models and algorithms in fantasy sports. I understand that. I would never criticize someone for having that perspective, but take it as a challenge. If you think they're really good, can you beat them? And even if you can't, find another way to enjoy the game. Find joy in the game itself, rather than just being like, oh, I can't beat the AIs and the models. If you can't, you can't. And if you don't want to take that into account, create a mini league with your friends where you all agree not to use it, or just find a way to still find the enjoyment in the game. So yeah, I don't know that I desperately love the introduction of AI and models into fantasy sports, but it's a part where it's going to be there, and I think you just find a way to still enjoy the game in and around that.
I mean, I agree completely. So I think I probably... the question wasn't worded so much as does it have a place, but more rather, as you answered, like, how do we adapt and approach our strategy with playing the game? And I think kind of I look at it no different to the introduction of new chips. And for instance, in FPL recently, there's been essentially a duplication of chips to be used throughout the season for 25-26. In F1 Fantasy, we've got 6 chips we have to use over a 24 race season. So there's, these things change every year, and I think it's more the evolution of the players and managers that really define the game, and not necessarily the tools or the models themselves and how we react. And I find whenever there's something new introduced, it just creates another way of thinking, and you get those really bright individuals in these communities that can think of ways that others may not have even considered to begin with. So I think it's just another way of playing the game rather than a roadblock to success in say, fantasy sports.
Yeah, I would agree with all that.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to see how the last couple seasons and the next few seasons will really dictate the flow of fantasy sports. I feel like there's so much to unpack in psychology, but I also know and want to be respectful of your time. In terms of kind of general strategy and mindset for the rest of the season, Ross, or for the upcoming season for FPL, kind of how are you going to play it? Do you think there's going to be the same approach you take to your 38 game season, or with the new chips I mentioned, do you think that maybe changes how you're playing the sport this year?
I think this will go for FPL, F1 Fantasy. I know we were going to discuss some stuff like risk reward as well. Like, I
Yeah,
think the
yeah,
key
yeah,
thing for
definitely.
me is just understand who you are as a person, how you make decisions, and what your almost like philosophy is as a player of that game. Like, how does the game make sense to you? Because to some people, it makes so much sense to take risks every week because it's a fantasy game. They'll be like, why on earth are you playing safe? Like, where's the joy in that? It
Yeah,
doesn't
no,
even matter what
definitely.
the outcome is. The whole point is that you have fun and pick differentials and pick drivers that no one else. So if that's your perspective, then do that. Some people will be like, why would I take risks when I know there's a 90% chance that risk doesn't work? Right? I'd rather play safe. That's where I find the enjoyment. So
Yeah.
then they won't take risks. And it's the same with strategy as well. For some people, an early and fast strategy makes a lot of sense. So if we go back to FPL and there's all of these chips, lots of people will bench boost, triple captain, free hit wildcard in the first 4 weeks, and they'll be flying. They'll be 50 points clear in their mini league at least. They'll have a great start. And some people go, haha, idiots, I'm going to save mine for a better time in the future. But again, it doesn't matter. All strategies are relevant. All strategies are viable. It's what fits you. Because where you'll start to come unstuck in fantasy is if you try and follow a strategy or philosophy that doesn't make sense to you as a person. So let's say someone starts watching my content and I'm probably a balance between pretty safe with the odd maverick streak, but someone starts copying me and they're like, why is this guy rolling his transfer every week? Like, I can't do that. And so if you start trying to copy me and then trying to chuck a bit of your own in, you'll get into a really, really tricky position. So my advice is try and sit there and think about how you think the game should be played and try and roughly stick to that. And then if there are new things added in, whether that be chips or new strategies or there's additional races, whatever it is,
Course.
you then adapt from that sort of core foundation or framework of decision making.
No, agreed. And I think that again kind of goes back to the point before around just how we tackle each few weeks. I almost look at the season in kind of blocks of 4 or 5 rather than 124
Yeah.
race calendar, because as soon as you're thinking 10 or 5, 10, 12 races or games down or game weeks down the track, it's like you're not actually focusing on what's in front of you and how you want to tackle that with your transfers and your chips. And I think for me, I'd probably err more on the side of the risk averse. I mean, I agree. I have kind of moments of maverickness, to use the word you used before, but I think for me personally, I'm more of a patient approach and willing to kind of deploy the chips and the strategies at the right time rather than maybe making a rash decision which might pay off but also equally may not. So it's interesting how similar the FPL and F1 fantasy communities overlap in that respect.
Yeah, I'd say so. Because again, all it is just how well can you manage yourself. We all
Yeah.
understand the sports we're playing the games for.
Yeah.
It's just how well can you execute your decisions on a weekly basis.
Definitely. Well, I mean, that has been one of the most insightful discussions I've ever had, Ross, around psychology and fantasy sports generally. Before we wrap up, could I get, and I know we're halfway through the season at the point of recording in F1 fantasy or in F1, but can I get your predictions for the Drivers' Championship between, I mean, it's Lando, Oscar, or is it someone else? Because we alluded to it before, but didn't really get into detail.
Yeah, so the Drivers' Championship leader going into the final race will be Alex Albon. No, joking. It will be. So I'll make two predictions for you.
Yeah.
First prediction, I think Oscar Piastri will win. I just think that at the moment he has that edge, and as I said, with Lando not having innately the resilience and psychological profile, I think, to be a serial winner at the moment, I think he will fall short. So even if Lando, I think, is winning going into the final 3 races, like let's say he's got a slight points advantage, I still feel like he might let that slip, whereas I just think that's when Oscar will push on. So I'll say Oscar this season. Then I would say my second prediction, because obviously I think everyone's saying Oscar, is I think next year, we'll have to see what happens with the new regulations, but I will say at least that Lando will finish higher than Oscar. I don't know whether it will be McLaren dominance, but I think Lando will bounce back and finish ahead of Oscar. Whether it be Max being there or Charles or Lewis, I don't know. But I would just say that I think next year Lando might have the better of him after this year, if he can work on some stuff over the break.
It would truly be a rebound for the ages if he came back from losing the championship to securing one the next season, because it feels like whenever Oscar even wins a race, Lando has to pick up the pieces. So I would be fascinated to see that turnaround mentally from Lando if something like that transpired. But like you say, all eyes on the new regulations next year, because anything could happen.
Yeah, exactly. I want to see Kimi have a strong end to the season, by the way. We didn't really speak about his psychology, but seeing how well he started and obviously struggling a little bit now, I'd love to, again, he's someone I'd love to speak to and just understand where his head's at, because I think he's very, very mature for his age, and I think he's shown resilience already, but it's a tough spot to be in this sport when you're at a top team and lack of experience. So I really hope he has a strong back half of the season.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see someone as young as him, and even Oscar in his third year, look 10, 12, 15 years older than they really are in terms of how they carry themselves. So an aspirational and really great trait to have. So yeah, look, Ross, I know it was a hard and fast 30, 45 minutes, but it was one of the most insightful discussions I've had on the channel, and it's nice to talk about something that relates to fantasy sports without obviously being in the nitty-gritty of F1 fantasy, FPL, etc. So look, thank you for coming on. As I said at the start, I'll have all of your channels in the description below, but where can people find you?
So people, anywhere, just type in FPL Raptor and I'll pop up. But more importantly, because you have not plugged your own channel enough, make sure to subscribe to the channel you're watching this on as well, because plenty more sort of F1 and fancy content. And I'm sure we'll do this again at some point, and maybe we can have more of a chat maybe in the off season, in the lead up to 2026 new regs. We can have a bit of a chat about the psychology of the drivers a bit more, and kind of where their heads are at after their previous season, because there'll be so many narratives with Lewis and Charles and Kimi and all these drivers, and obviously any rookies as well. And I'd love to discuss the rookies in more detail. So yeah, if people want to see that, let us know in the comments.
Of course, yeah, and like I said at the start, Ross has had plenty of guests on his channels. FPL Therapy was another one that he didn't plug, but one I thoroughly enjoy watching, and pays homage, I think, a little bit to the psychology aspect of fantasy sports. So look, Ross, thank you for coming on today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and good luck with the upcoming FPL season.
Cheers, mate. Thank you very much.
So guys, I hope you enjoyed today's video. It was one of my most fascinating and interesting guests I've had on the channel so far this year. It was really interesting to unpack the psychological and mental aspect of playing fantasy sports. So if you enjoyed what you see, throw a like on the video, subscribe to the channel. All of Ross's channels and such will be in the description below, so please do follow him and extend that gratitude for him coming onto the channel. It truly was such a great time. I will be back with more F1 fantasy content throughout the rest of the off-season or summer break, and we'll be picking things back up in the lead up to the Netherlands Grand Prix, or the Dutch Grand Prix. So in the meantime, guys, as I said, show some love to the channel. I will be back very shortly with more content. Have a great day, and I will see you all very soon.